will be able to catch up with the recording of the event. We will post it on our YouTube channel, but we will also make little clips available for social media, and you'll be able to catch up on the discussion. First of all, welcome. Thank you once again for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the right to stay, what it means for European nationals in Scotland and the UK in general. What can we be doing better to fight for migrants' rights, and what are some of the main issues that we will be seeing in the years to come, but also opportunities for us to do things better, to have a better immigration system, and to use the levers of power within the Scottish Parliament to fight for people's rights. My name is Elena. I'm a campaigns organizer for Another Europe is Possible, and I am joined by a lovely panel of candidates for the Scottish Labour Party, Scottish Greens, the Lib Dems. We've got a very last minute apology, unfortunately, from the SNP candidate who was going to join us, but loads of candidates for the Scottish elections have signed up to our pledge, which is very encouraging and great to see. And I'm very grateful to everyone who has responded so positively and shared the campaign, shared the information. We also have Caitlin Boswell from JCWY, who is one of the leading organisations working on migration and migrants' rights across the UK. So the way this is going to work is we'll just talk a little bit about the campaign, why it's needed, why we started the pledge, and what we've identified as some of the issues. Caitlin is going to expand on that and talk a bit more about the work that the JCWI have been doing as well, where there are opportunities for more campaigning, for more policy work, where we can push collectively to get change from the Home Office. And then we'll also hear from the candidates why they support the pledge, why it's important for them to defend migrants' rights, and why it's important for Scotland and for their roles as representatives in the Scottish Parliament, hopefully. So what is the right to stay? Why are we talking about the right to stay? Another Europe is Possible from the beginning, from its inception, has been campaigning on a very firm pro-migrant platform. It was one of our key Remain arguments back in the olden days when we were fighting the referendum campaign. Then throughout the Brexit process, we were fighting to defend freedom of movement and to make the positive case for keeping freedom of movement. And we continue to fight for migrants' rights and to make the case for migrants' rights. We do recognize that obviously a system that puts one group of migrants above another is not ideal, and that's not what we're arguing for at all. But we also don't think that the solution to any problem is to take rights away from one group of people that already have some rights, but to elevate and to make sure that everyone has rights and security and dignity and access. We believe that migration is a natural part of life, and we also think that it's a policy area that needs quick action, and we need to do a lot of work actually to change and shift the narratives around migration if we want to fully grasp and tackle with some of the impacts of the climate emergency, for example, and what that would mean for the movement of people across the world. As you may hear, I myself am a migrant. I came from Bulgaria 8 years ago to study in London, where I lived until December 2020. And then I moved to Glasgow. So I am a very recent Scot. But Scotland's image as a more welcoming nation has definitely played a part in my decision to move here. And I believe that is the case for many people who choose to make Scotland their home from across the world. I want to make this point quite early on in our discussion. I'm very conscious that our speakers are representing different viewpoints on devolution and independence, and that does play some role in terms of the powers that are available to make decisions. But I think what we can all agree on is that the hostile environment rules currently in place are damaging to our communities. And so I would like us to focus on things that could be done in the immediate future with the existing powers of the Scottish Parliament and within the existing system to as much as possible. And that's why it was important for us when we started this campaign and did the pledge to look at the root of why we think the settled status program won't work or will have problems for some people. And the root of that problem is that the rules of the hostile environment are still in place, and there are still many barriers for people who are unable to produce the right documents or don't look the way that institutions expect them to look, and are subjected to more checks, more hostility, and more suspicion. We launched the Right to Stay campaign last year when it became increasingly clear to us that there will be many cracks in the settled status scheme that the Home Office had designed. And the demands are quite simple. We think that all European nationals living in the UK should be automatically given the right to stay. And that should be done by a very simple declaratory system. Failing to do that, which the Home Office is quite intent on, we think the existing deadline of the 30th of June should not be in place. That should be scrapped. You cannot impose a deadline to what is supposed to be a broad and inclusive scheme, especially given the difficulties that some communities are facing in applying for status, in working with their granted status, and also with the lack of physical proof of status. And we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, that people have been forced through different economic hardship and different economic situations, perhaps longer absences than what the Home Office has allowed for in its design of the settled status scheme. And all those people are gonna be disadvantaged one way or another. The current system is not what European nationals were promised in the Brexit referendum campaign. They are not given the status quo. They are not given the rights that they had at that point. They're required to apply through a system. And every time you apply for something, the presumption is that you could be denied it. There's a deadline attached, which is quite unrealistic to meet, especially given the fact that the Home Office does not know how many people are actually eligible for this program and for this status. And as more and more people are going through the process, we are better able to understand where the issues actually are and who are the groups that are more at risk. And that's something that I'm sure Caitlin will touch upon, because they've done some really interesting work around awareness and where awareness is lacking. Recently, I worked to put together a very brief briefing report with some of the major issues that remain with the scheme. And it is the case, for example, that the settled status program actually grants two different kinds of status, the pre-settled status and the settled one. And there are now 2 million people in the UK who have been granted the less secure pre-settled status. All of those people will have to then reapply to continue benefiting from the settled status program and to continue accessing and exercising their rights freely. Not everyone is aware of that, but also importantly, Not everyone will be able to meet the requirements of the settled status program in time when their pre-settled status expires. We know, for example, that the Home Office has recently said that they understand late applications will need to be made, and they've outlined the grounds on which they will accept late applications. What we don't know, though, is what will happen to people in that gap when they have lost their rights given to them under freedom of movement. They have not made an application, so there will be a gap in their immigration history where they've been without status. That is going to impact them in time if they look at naturalization, applying for citizenship, or a variety of other issues that they may have in the future. We know that employers are confused and workers are confused about the new system and what it means for people who are already in the UK, who may be eligible to apply for settled status, but haven't done so yet, or are waiting for their applications, or in fact don't know that they have to do it. We have seen cases of European nationals who have already started jobs without actually being eligible for status, while many others with pending applications are being turned down for jobs because they can't prove their status yet, even though they're not supposed to until the 1st of July. From many frontline organizations, I myself provide immigration advice for Bulgarians, and we do this daily on this huge forum, which now has about 15,000 members. People struggle with the language, and people struggle with the digital skills, and sometimes they struggle with both. And the application process is only the first step. People are supposed and expected to use a digital system that they will have to navigate every time they go through any administrative procedure in their lives. They have to be able to prove their status online for every job, every landlord, every institution, every time they go to a hospital, every time they have to apply for some sort of a benefit. And there are people who can barely manage the process just to get the application in. There is not enough support built into this system in the long term to be able to support everyone who will need that. So there's a myriad of issues out there, and we can talk a bit more about that later on. But this is the context in which we decided that it's important to make the case for the right to stay, but also important to push through every channel available to us for a better system, better understanding of the problems, more support, and more practical ways in which we can help migrants navigate this horror. So with that said, and with the introduction in place, I'm going to turn to Caitlin. Sorry, I think you should be on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Elena. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much for having me. My name's Caitlin and I work for the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. As Elena said, we're a migrants' rights organisation. I think Elena's kind of touched on a lot of the things that we're most concerned about, but I'm just going to give a kind of very brief overview of the hostile environment and why the fight for EU citizens' rights has become so relevant to the fight to dismantle the hostile environment. So for anyone who doesn't know, the hostile environment is a set of policies that were introduced in 2012 by then Immigration Minister Theresa May, basically designed to make life in the UK impossible for people without the right status. It tasks landlords, teachers, medical professionals, employers with checking people's immigration status and then sharing this information with the Home Office. It also prevents most migrants, including those with visas, from accessing most benefits. This system obviously turns people against each other. It makes us it turns down our trust in these vital public services, and it also turns statutory authorities into border guards. It makes all migrants, but particularly those who are undocumented, as well as those who are Black and minority ethnic, less likely to seek support with benefits, with healthcare, and treats anyone who kind of looks or sounds foreign as though they are something to be suspicious of. People might have heard that the right to rent policy, which is a kind of a cornerstone of the hostile environment, JCWI took the government to court over this policy in 2018, and last year it was found by the High Court and the Court of Appeal to cause racial discrimination. So yeah, that will be going on to the Supreme Court soon. Up until now, EU citizens have largely, on the whole, been protected from the hostile environment by freedom of movement. But with Brexit and the government's arrangement for EU citizens, that's all changed. And as a result of that, it's crucial, as I said, that the fight and the movement for EU citizens' rights is to protect all migrants' rights and to dismantle the hostile environment. So the EU settlement scheme, as Elena mentioned, is a scheme that all EU citizens and their family members have to apply to by the 30th of June in order to continue living lawfully in the UK after that date. And anyone who doesn't apply will fall out of status and rights overnight as a result, which will create a significant new population of undocumented migrants vulnerable to hostile environment policies, including detention and removal. And this isn't an insignificant minority. We don't know how many EU citizens are resident in the UK, but if even 1% of the estimated 4 million are unable to apply, that's tens of thousands of people without status. And no scheme of this kind has ever succeeded in reaching 100% of its audience. So there's no reason why this one would. EU citizens who have lived and worked in the UK for years could become criminalised for working, renting accommodation, opening a bank account, just for living their daily lives. And there's overwhelming evidence that says that it's the most marginalised in society, including looked after children, older and disabled people, Roma communities, homeless people who are the most at risk of slipping through the cracks. But recent research done by JCWI found that EU care workers and other key workers, so the very people we're relying on to get us through COVID, are also in real danger of being left behind because of a lack of awareness. And these people are much less likely to be regarded as an exception for late application because they're not perceived of as vulnerable in the same way. This has really concerning implications for other at-risk sectors, which we've identified as those with similar working conditions to care, so agriculture, manufacturing and construction being just some of those. So why is it so important to resist the hostile environment? Well, JCWI and many others, including Another Europe, are calling on the government to grant automatic rights to EU citizens. So we're calling on the government to lift the EUSS deadline. And this isn't a radical ask, it's what was promised by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel during the 2016 Leave campaign. And it's the only real way to protect EU citizens' rights and prevent tens of thousands of people becoming criminalised. But unless we resist the hostile environment as a whole, EU citizens and all migrants, as I said, particularly those who are undocumented, those who are minority ethnic, will continue to suffer. And in the context of a global pandemic where it's crucial that people are able to access healthcare, they're able to access the state safety net if they're unable to work or if they need to isolate, this couldn't be more important. But as it stands, thousands of migrants are reluctant to go and seek healthcare. We did some recent research that found that even those who have the right to use the NHS are reluctant because of the culture of NHS charging and data sharing with the Home Office. And because for so many people to isolate means destitution if you can't access benefits. That's just not a reality for so many migrants. And we know that with COVID, we're only going to overcome this if we are all protected and if we can all seek support. So the hostile environment is sort of getting in the way of all of that, and it's more important than ever that we seek to dismantle it. So aside from just our campaign for EU citizens' rights, we're also campaigning for more safe and legal routes to regularisation so that less migrants are forced out of status and can regularise and settle in the UK. We're also got a new campaign called Work It Out, where we're campaigning to decriminalise all forms of work and scrap no recourse to public funds so migrants can access state benefits. Yeah, so in terms of, I don't want to kind of paint a picture that it's all bad, because in some ways the pandemic has provided us with a real opportunity to change, and we've seen things push through in government that we've been campaigning on for decades, and that have come through overnight. So it is an opportunity. I would encourage people to join JCWI. We're a membership organisation. Write to your MP. We've got Write to Your MP tools to support EU citizens' rights and migrant workers' rights. And in terms of the Scottish Government have been so supportive all along for that, they agree with our asks. They've been campaigning for a declaratory scheme as well and lobbying Westminster. So call on your MSP to do the same. And yeah, there are loads of ways that you can get involved, but that's just a few of them. Sorry if I went a bit over on time, Elena, but that's all from me for now.
No worries, Caitlin. I definitely did, so it's fine. Thank you very much for this very kind of clear snapshot into what the situation currently is and where we're missing people out, basically where they are, where the sort of the network of support and policy in place is so threadbare that people are definitely going to fall through. But I like what you said about the pandemic being seen as an opportunity as well, to maybe shift some of the narratives and the policies. And because I want to give our candidates like a positive note on which to start with their contributions, I'm going to turn to Katrina Sender, who is a Labour candidate for Edinburgh North, I believe. Yes. And I wanted to ask you, Katrina, why did you support the pledge? Why do you think this is an important issue that we should be working on, and where you see the role of the Scottish Parliament, where changes could be made?
Yeah, thank you. It's Edinburgh, Northern and Leith. It's one of the long constituency names, and actually one of the constituencies in Scotland with the highest vote to remain in the EU, and a very lot of European nationals living in there. It's a very personal thing to me as well, because I actually benefited from the freedom of movement, because I spent most of my working life working around Europe for more than 3 decades, in fact, and moved back to Scotland just a few years ago with my partner, who's Italian, and his stepdaughter. And even our dogs benefited from EU pet passports, and the freedom of movement into here as well. I obviously, I come from an immigrant family as well, and I, really appreciate the huge benefits that immigration has brought to Scotland. And I really dislike borders, and I think it's really quite important for me to say that I want to break down borders. I don't want to create them, and I also really oppose the borders that the EU itself creates around itself and doesn't let people in to the to Europe as well. And I think that that's something we've got to be quite honest about. I think that we've got to start on a sort of basis of solidarity, with EU nationals and supporting their right to stay. And very important, this self-declaration. I did my partner's application, online application for pre-settled status, and he could never have, he's just not technically adept, and he could never have managed that himself, and that's really something that we should be quite ashamed of. So, the work that you're doing, providing information and help is really, really crucial. I think we also have to help people in Scotland understand how drastic the situation is, because I don't actually think people realise what's going to happen in July. What the reality of a lot of people's lives is going to become, the situation that then their friends and their family, because like I say, it's very personal. We had always hoped that maybe my partner has 3 daughters, and that maybe one of his other daughters with her children might come and live here with us, and that becomes very different when we're moving into this kind of hostile environment. Obviously, we are limited with what we can do in the Scottish Parliament, because it involves a lot of devolved powers, and I think that this is where what becomes really crucial is what kind of people we elect to Holyrood. So I would say that this is a moment that we don't need more members of the political class elected into Holyrood. We need campaigners. We need people who will actually put themselves at the heart of a resistance campaign to the hostile environment, and actually who put a lot of pressure on agencies and local government to actually start defying no recourse to public funds, because I think that is something that we should do, on a human rights basis and on a moral basis. We should be defying that when there's benefits that we can actually give out. And I think that another role, a really important role for elected representatives, MSPs and all of them, is actually to rally our communities as well, to unite around people who are friends, neighbours, family members as well, as we are moving into the sort of the post July period, when a lot of people are going to find themselves actually struggling to stay as well. So that's a sort of a summary, but it is something that I feel incredibly strong about. And what I've said does represent what is the current policies of the Labour Party as well, which we adopted, around the whole Brexit debate as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Katrina. And I do love that background image. It's wonderful. And now I'm going to ask the other Katrina Battier, to say a few words, roughly on the same kind of lines. Why do you think this is important? Why does it matter to you as a candidate, but also to the people that you're hoping to represent, and what the role of an MSP could be in all of this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm assuming that most of us are probably not in favour of Brexit. And, I've always been pro-European, pro-internationalist. That's what Liberal Democrats are in our party. And it's, we were incredibly disappointed that Brexit went ahead. But this sort of fallout and the impact on people, that just makes me angry. And I think, we have to get a bit more angry about the way that people are being treated, because sometimes you forget it is people, it's individuals, it's their families, and then it's their livelihoods, and it's their communities, and it's their employment. And, this is all kind of happening slightly under the radar. I know you said it's maybe partly because of the pandemic situation, and I would agree with Caitlin that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And if this is going to be in any way beneficial, then that's what we should do. But I think the way that migration has been portrayed in this country for years actually has been nothing short of scandalous. And the whole thrust behind Brexit wasn't anti-EU. Actually, a lot of it was anti-immigrant. And I think some of the rhetoric around that and some of the unpleasantness around that was just appalling. You'll probably tell from my surname that I'm married to an immigrant. And when people say to me, "Oh well, no, it's not people like your husband we object to because he's an executive in a whiskey firm," I say, well, when he came to this country, he was a student. He worked 3 jobs. He worked 14 hours a day to support him and send money home and get his degree. So, you're saying that, okay, it's okay now, he's in the community. But, most immigrants, when they come here, unless certainly the ones that will now be allowed to come here, are looking to improve themselves, to get a better life, to contribute to our society, to contribute to our communities. How we're going to run the NHS, how we're going to run the social care system, how we're going to run our agriculture without the freedom of movement. I think we will come to rue the position that we've taken. So the other thing which I think is quite staggering is the system that's been put in place, apart from being deeply illiberal and frankly a bit inhumane, is it's so bureaucratic, it's so complex. It must be costing an absolute arm and leg of public money to implement, when actually, people were promised. I mean, Boris Johnson and the Tories promised that EU nationals would have an automatic right to stay. And to go back on that in such an unpleasant and hostile way, I think is just, it is a scandal. And the more that we as hopefully elected members, or even if we're not elected, I would be more than happy to stay and campaign on this, because there's things in politics which to me are just right and wrong. And what is going on here is just wrong. So as I say, I'm all for a liberal UK, and that means a liberal Europe, a liberal international perspective on the world, and how on earth we're going to recover our economy without having an encompassing and inclusive environment rather than a hostile environment. I have no idea. So I despair at what's going on, to be frank, and I will do whatever I can to support people and to make a difference in the Scottish Parliament, albeit we don't have as many powers as that are needed to solve this. But I do think the biggest thing we can do is to try and influence the UK government, and indeed influence the Conservative MSPs in the Parliament to influence their government, because some of them stood at the European Parliament saying nothing would change after Brexit. Well, time for them to stand up and actually, show that they're in solidarity with our European citizens as well. So that's my pitch.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And now over to Laura. Laura from the Scottish Greens. Laura is, one second. Laura is also a candidate for the South Scotland region.
Yes, the opposite example to Katrina. My area is one of the areas that where the Brexit vote was closest. And I think there's a whole range of reasons for that. I'm also the candidate for the Galloway and West Dumfries constituency. And it's very clear where we live the impact of Europeans and all migrants really propping up a gigantic hole in our demographics. We have a missing generation in the South Scotland. Young people move away, and we have a lot of older people and a lot of employment here, especially in frankly low paid, undervalued jobs like care work, like agricultural work. The gap has been filled for a number of years by immigrants from Europe and beyond, and those people are already leaving, and that's causing huge problems for our communities. I also am a campaigner and activist. I was one of the founding trustees for Massive Outpouring of Love, which is Dumfries and Galloway based refugee charity, which set up in response to the Syrian sort of climate and war migrant crisis in 2015, and as a result of that and the massive groundswell of support that came from an area where traditionally there's been quite a lot of hostility to immigration, was wonderful to see, but also meant that the council for the first time accepted through the VPRS scheme immigration. It's had a really positive impact in terms of, as Katrina was mentioning, that dialogue and discussion about immigration and dialing down some of the temperature of the debate. But there's still so much work to do in rural areas in terms of changing hearts and minds and helping people to see the vast positive contribution that migrants make to communities across Scotland. And I think that's really important to get across. Obviously, the Scottish Greens do believe in an independent Scotland in the heart of Europe, and it's massively frustrating that until we're independent, we're not going to have those powers. That said, there are more powers that could be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And yes, we can put pressure on Westminster, but the difference in attitudes and the difference in approach and the different priorities of the two countries, I feel are just so vast now that I just don't see how, certainly for the term of the existing Conservative government in England, how we are going to affect a meaningful change there. So we need to look at the powers we've got. For a while, the Greens have been campaigning about scrapping the no recourse to public funds, and that absolutely has to happen. We'd like to abolish the Home Office, quite frankly, if we could, and just use more of the powers that we do have to create a more open attitude to immigration, and to build that into all of our structures. That is doable, but I mean, as we've already seen with the decision of the UK government to challenge some of the UNCRC bill or the rights being enshrined in Scottish law and the European Charter on Local Government, we are going to keep coming up against this hostility at every turn. And it's going to take really courageous MSPs and politicians of all hues to get together and be absolutely dogmatic about insisting on ploughing our own course on this, because I don't see how in the time, because this is time sensitive. We've only got a few months until this deadline, and then beyond, we are going to make the change that we need to make. It's going to take a huge collective effort, but it's necessary. Areas like mine are going to really struggle if people are forced to leave. Areas like mine are going to really struggle if people are left undocumented and without support and help. And I can't see any way around that that doesn't involve a huge concerted political effort.
Thank you, Laura. I think a huge concerted political effort is what we all would like to kind of build and contribute towards. I thought something that you said around especially more rural communities and agriculture-based communities is quite interesting. And I wanted to ask Caitlin a question, which is, we often think about the measures of the Home Office and the measures of the Tory government as aimed to limit migration, but in reality, what they often aim to do is to just leave people with less rights rather than keep people out. In the context, especially around some of the new proposed temporary visas, for example, what can you tell us, Caitlin, about what kind of temporary agricultural workers will be asked to do? What will be basically their access to the job market in the UK?
Yeah, so I think you're completely right. The conversation is around the hostile environment seems to be based on, we're doing this in order to put a limit on migration and reduce undocumented migration. But research has found that as well as causing discrimination against minorities, as well as causing such harm in the way that it does, the hostile environment doesn't even succeed on its own terms. It hasn't been found to reduce undocumented migration. And as you mentioned, with the new plans for immigration, which are, to be honest, they're the most kind of regressive plans that we've seen in a generation to the immigration system. And we're all obviously within the migrant sector, we're really concerned about that. Things like more temporary worker visas are dangerous, because if you tie a migrant to their job, that makes it more likely that they will experience work exploitation and then not be able to escape that exploitation or report it to authorities. It's going to drive more people into undocumented status. And what we really need to see is more safe and legal routes to regularization. We're hearing Priti Patel talk about it's fine for people who have a real reason to come here, but we want to crack down on everyone else. But they're not proposing any new alternatives. In fact, they're just going to make it more dangerous for people who are trying to get here in other means. So yeah, there's a lot that can be said about the new proposals, but most of them are really, really dangerous, and we're strongly opposing them at the moment. But like in terms of other worker visas, we obviously know with the new points-based system, for a lot of key workers and the very people we were kind of been clapping for once a week during this year will actually be excluded. Most care workers do not earn enough to come here under the new points-based system. And if we think about a care industry where potentially thousands of EU care workers will fall out of status after the deadline, and then on top of that we're excluding migrant care workers from coming to the UK, and it was already in such a weakened state due to 10 years of austerity and cuts, it's really, really concerning. And I think it's very short-sighted of the government. They're not thinking about kind of how we're going to keep this country going in the long run. But yeah, there's lots that can be said on the new plans, but yeah, another reason to kind of get involved and challenge the immigration system. There is actually currently a 6-week engagement and consultation live where either organisations or individuals can respond to the Home Office and on your views about the proposals for the new immigration system. So we'd encourage people to respond to that and just say, we don't think these are good ideas, we think they're going to cause more harm than good. And you can do that whether or not you work in the sector.
Brilliant. I'll try and dig out some links and post them in the chat as well, but we'll be sharing around. all of that information so that people can do that in their own time. And that's just my personal note to everyone will be: don't feel intimidated when you're feeling in a government consultation. You really can be as specific as you'd like and as detailed or as emotional as you'd like on these things. They really are open for everyone to contribute, and the more of us contribute, the less skewed the views that are presented are going to be towards a particular, kind of institutional line. So I do think everyone should participate in that consultation and anything that the Home Office runs in general. But I wanted to ask, by the way, if anyone from the audience wants to ask a question or a comment, you can use the raise hand function. But in the meantime, unfortunately, we had to say goodbye to Katrina because she had another hustings to go to. But we do have Katrina Bhatia with us still, and I wanted to ask you, Katrina, do you feel that the parties are doing and candidates are doing enough or all that they can to engage migrants as the electorate as well? Because obviously they do have the right to vote in these Scottish elections. Do you think that collectively as a society we're promoting that enough and people know that they have this right?
If I'm honest, I would say probably not. I mean, Laura will recognise in the south of Scotland, we have a very, we don't have the most diverse of communities, shall we say. So it's not always deemed a priority by the councils to reach out. I know that they do provide material in different languages, and in particular for some of the EU communities where they have particular concentrations of EU migrants, then they do try and reach out to them a bit more. But I wonder if somehow businesses could perhaps assist with that. And that's, I mean, I'm certainly happy to go and talk to the councils and ask them if they might do that, because I think because EU citizens and other migrants don't always have a vote in every election, I think it's even more confusing. They didn't get a vote in the Brexit one. There's, different rules around Westminster and EU elections, and it's a minefield. I mean, it's hard enough to get people who are UK citizens to go out to vote, but other people who've got other nationalities, etc., it's much more difficult. And I think, if we're seeking to represent them, then we have to be able to get their votes and engage with them. And it's especially difficult at the moment because you can only engage people via Zoom. With data protection, it's actually quite difficult also for phoning people up, etc. So no, I don't think we do enough, if I'm perfectly honest. I think all parties are trying to be more diverse, to be more inclusive, but in terms of encouraging people to vote, I think that's something we could improve on for sure.
Absolutely, it's a tricky one, isn't it? One thing I found, I know in 2017 in the council elections, we wrote to a lot of EU residents directly to say they could vote in this election, but since then there's been 2 elections where they couldn't vote, and the franchise was only extended fairly recently for the Scottish Parliament election. So now, I mean, essentially almost everybody who lives in Scotland who's over 16 can vote in this election, and you've only got until Monday next week, a week today, to register. So if you're sat watching this thinking, I didn't know that, make sure you go and register to vote. But one of the problems is also, by their nature, a migrant workforce is often moving around. So we've not been able to do the doorstep canvassing over the last year that we would normally do to make sure our records are up to date and we're following up with voters and where they're at. So that's really challenging. We're very reliant on the records that we're getting from the electoral registration officer being up to date. And I think particularly when you've got this hostile environment bubbling under, when you've got the issue of looming deadlines, I think that often deters people a little from registering. They maybe don't want to be on a database somewhere. So there's a whole mixture of challenges there, and I think it's really up to parties to try and overcome that and reach out as best they can and make sure people know that their rights and have their say.
we've just had a very interesting question from Regine Lafayette. If you'd like to ask it, I'm very happy to allow you to speak. If not, I'm also happy to, ask it on your behalf. Oh no, we're doing the constant chasing of the mute button. I think I click mute and then unmute, and you're clicking at the same time. Hello?
Hello?
Brilliant. Oh, we can hear you, Regine.
Oh, okay. Now, and my question is, I've got settled status and I've no physical proof, as you've mentioned before, that you have to go into a website to find out if you've got settled status at the border or anywhere you want to go. So I was wondering if the Scottish government could have the power to give a physical proof to people living in Scotland, since the Home Office is not giving it to people. Hello?
Yep, we heard that, we got that, Regine. I'm gonna mute you again, but yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? If the Home Office won't give out a physical proof, is there any power that the Scottish Parliament could use to issue, I suppose, its own document, because it won't be a Home Office issued document? And would that be in any way, I guess it could be useful in institutions in Scotland, if not for traveling and other purposes in England. What do you guys think about that? It's fine if you've not done all the research behind it.
I mean, I think it's a great plan, and again, this comes down to the having politicians in Scotland being a bit bolshy and asserting ourselves and saying, actually, we're not going to just put up with this. So, yeah, the Scottish government couldn't give a document that necessarily would be valid in terms of the Home Office and the UK government, but there had to be some weight to a document that was officially produced by a governing body in the country in which someone's resident. So I don't see why we can't do that, even if it is purely a symbolic statement of intent. I think it would go a long way to showing people that there is a willingness in Scotland to do that and to push the boundaries a little bit.
Thanks, Laura. Not to put you on the spot, Katrina, but does that sound workable to you?
Well, in theory, I think they probably could do that. I mean, I'm thinking of things like the Young Scot card, which a lot of young people have, which will allow them to access free bus travel if that comes in, and they use it for school meals, etc. So, in theory, that could happen. I mean, I would have to say, as Liberals, we are always very suspicious of any form of ID cards, whether they be ID cards for COVID or just general sort of requiring somebody to show an ID card of some description to access services. I think it could happen. I couldn't say what the Lib Dem policy on it would be. It makes me slightly uncomfortable. So I always say I'm not an intellectual liberal. I'm a emotional liberal. So if it doesn't feel right, then I probably think it's not really very liberal. But if it's something, if there is some way that we could assist in terms of, even persuading the Home Office to that it's discriminatory to just say to people you have to have some kind of electronic means of establishing your status. That the whole thing is, just discriminatory and illiberal. So if there is some way we can get around it without it becoming an actual ID card, then I think maybe that's something we could look at. Sorry if that sounds a bit wishy-washy about that.
No, it's absolutely fine. But when you were put on the spot, let's. Regina wanted to, I think, add something.
Yes, I mean, we all have accepted a driving license card. I've got a bus pass. So I don't have a problem with IDs like you do have. So I don't see why I can't get a card for proving that I've got a settled status.
Yes, well, Caitlin, do you know what the Home Office's general argument is against like moving everything to a digital system? Because that's what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to ultimately move all everything to a digital system.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that we've been, I mean, even from such a Tory majority government, we've been surprised that they have been so resistant to this, to physical documentation for EU citizens, when it's been something that people across the board have been calling for, including people within the Tory party. And I think the reason does come down to, as you say, it's this insistence on the future is digital. We're moving towards a fully digitalized system, not just for EU citizens, but soon for all migrants. They've confirmed that recently, that is the goal within the next few years. And from our perspective, not only does that kind of deny EU citizens what so many of them want, which is physical proof of status, but it also, it's kind of a digitalization of the hostile environment, and it's only going to make it easier to enforce the hostile environment if it's fully digitalized. So at the moment, we already have data sharing between the Home Office and public authorities, but that's only going to get easier if it's kind of all one big automated digital system. Essentially what it is kind of ID cards online, and that's really concerning, and it's most concerning for undocumented migrants and for people at the sharp end of the hostile environment. So we need to be really careful about kind of, yes, we want physical documentation, as we want EU citizens to have physical documentation to prove their status, but no, we don't want national ID cards, and no, we don't want a system that's going to just make it easier to enforce the hostile environment.
Thanks, Caitlin. Laura, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to come back slightly, because obviously we mentioned very briefly at the start Windrush, but one of the problems and that really led to the disaster of Windrush was the government essentially shredding what little documentation, paper evidence that people had, and then people were trapped in this Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare of having to prove negatives and prove things where the government themselves had willingly destroyed the documents that they were asking them to provide to prove that they had a right to be here. So it's a difficult balance, and certainly in my head I wasn't thinking necessarily an ID card. I was thinking something as simple, almost like not quite a birth certificate, but a document that the Scottish Parliament can provide that is evidence that somebody is ordinarily resident here, and the Scottish Parliament considers them to have a settled status.
I do think that a lot of, obviously, we've talked a lot about kind of the general narrative, the general messaging against migration that the government has been putting out there, and kind of the way their plans actually work to sort of undermine people's rights, not necessarily reduce numbers, so that people are still available to be workforce out there. But this whole kind of added aspect of the digitalization of this system, I think it poses particular challenges for some of the communities that, I guess because you're both now candidates in the south of Scotland, so we can kind of refer it even more specifically to kind of more rural communities, people who would be, who would fall under the settled status scheme. They would be eligible, but they work in the UK on a more temporary basis, and they kind of have this more transient life in the UK. But at the same time, it is a long-term arrangement. We, in my kind of immigration advice work, I get contacted by a lot of people who have spent 10, even 15 years coming to work in the UK on farms in different places, and they might spend 5 months at a time or 4 months at a time. Those people actually, given the pandemic, have now lost their right to apply for settled status, because they have not, even though they've spent 5 months each year for 10 years, that is not enough to prove permanent residency or continuous residency. And because of last year, 2020, what happened, some people have been reticent about returning, and they've skipped one season, and now they're no longer able to apply under this scheme. Suddenly they're faced with what Caitlin presented are some of these temporary agricultural worker schemes that completely cut off any route to settlement, and even the ease with which people with settled status could travel and return. So I think that's one area where we will see a lot of backlash. But I was wondering whether you've heard from employers, whether you've heard from any businesses in your communities about any concerns that people have with this scheme, or not yet. Maybe this is about to happen.
Certainly in the agricultural sector, there's a lot of trepidation about what's happened, because, you know, with some parts of Scotland, you know, where they've got the fruit farms and some of the potato farms, etc., you know, they have to have seasonal workers, and there isn't sufficient seasonal workers within the UK or Scotland that want to do that kind of work. To be frank, you know, it's not just the fact that there aren't people who are available to do it, because, you know, there probably are. It's whether people have got, and it's, you know, it's described as low skilled work, but actually it's backbreaking, and picking strawberries is still skilled work, because you've got to pick the ones that are going to be, you know, ripe and ready to go to market. So it's not unskilled work. And I think that that's part of the problem that's arisen, is that people have thought, you know, well, the migrant community, they're taking all these jobs that are low skilled. You know, social care work is not low skilled. It's incredibly skilled, and it's vitally important. So, you know, I think there's going to be a real crisis, not just within the agricultural sector, although they're the ones that seem to be alive to it. You know, they're the ones that are feeding in and saying, you know, we foresee problems here. But you know, in the NHS, social care, I mean, if every EU worker, whether they have settled status or not, just didn't work for one day in these sectors, can you imagine the kind of chaos that would cause? I mean, you know, that if they just said we're withdrawing our labour for one day, I mean, I wish they'd done that during the Brexit campaign, because I think people would have seen that, you know, the value of migrants. And a lot of businesses realised that. They weren't in favour of Brexit, but they're having to deal with the fallout now. So yeah, there's definite concern, as I say, particularly in the agricultural sector, but I think the other sectors will also feel the pinch as well.
Yeah, I think some of the disquiet about it has really been drowned out by obviously the more immediate concern about the impact of Brexit on trade. Certainly, I live on the coast, and prior to the pandemic and during the negotiations, when it became clear that the hardest possible Brexit was being pursued, a lot of the local employers in the fisheries sector said this is going to be hugely problematic for us, because they were very reliant on migrant labour for fish processing and packing, and even going out on the boats. So I think it's just been slightly overshadowed by the absolute disaster that Brexit has been in terms of export and the loss of that market, especially in the sectors that are most exposed, so agriculture, fisheries. And then, of course, in terms of the social care sector, it's been blown out of the water by the immediate crisis of the COVID pandemic. So it's been a perfect storm in many ways, of the combination of all of these things, making it really hard to get that narrative covered and that particular aspect of the issue covered. And I think in rural communities especially, this digital divide, it is a big issue. So something I've helped several friends with actually is just doing that bureaucratic process, and not least because it's very, very hard to do if you don't have the right tech. And if you're in an area with really poor broadband provision, it's incredibly difficult to go through the process. And often migrant workers, especially in the agriculture sector, they're out in farms in the middle of nowhere, very little public transport, very hard to get anywhere else, and often very, very poor broadband, so that they're just not able to go through the whole process.
Yeah, I think we will wrap up with some final remarks in a minute, but I think that's a really good point, because that's another thing that we see a lot from kind of frontline advice and services, is that there are many communities, especially more remote communities, where unless the employer takes an active role in assisting the workers with their applications, many people get left out and miss out on this process. But that in its own way creates problems, because then you have people who are in one way or another dependent on that particular employer. We see a lot of people, for example, who come to the UK. They don't actually have UK mobile phone numbers. They have their Romanian phone number or Bulgarian phone number or Ukrainian phone number, whatever. Not Ukrainian because they can't apply, but and then these people apply for status through their employer. They're actually trapped at the mercy of that employer to provide them access to their own status in many situations. And we see, I've been contacted by people who say, well, actually my employer helped me last year, but is now telling me they're not going to give me access to my status to change the number on it so I can use it, unless I promise to return and work for them. And I'm not able to take a job in another farm which pays maybe a little bit better or has a slightly better accommodation. I'm trapped in this farm with this employer because they helped me get the status. So I think we also, when we're talking about this and the problems that are going to come up with this particular scheme, we should also always be mindful of the ways that workers in those sectors are already being exploited. And this is only going to, adding this system onto it just facilitates more exploitation. So we should be looking at the intersection with workers' rights as well, I suppose. This has been a very informative conversation, and I'm really glad that you joined in. We have been recording, and we will continue recording for your final thoughts and notes. But I think for me, the takeaway would be that I guess, yeah, we need to be a bit angry and bolshy and try and think of creative ways that these institutions can be bent to some extent to our will, be that local councils, the Scottish Parliament, or any other avenue we have for action. So I'm gonna give the floor to you for final remarks in the opposite order. So Laura.
Thanks, Elena. Yeah, it's been really, really good being here tonight, and I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say and what JCWI had to say. And I think it's really clear that in Scotland there is so much goodwill and such a cross-party positivity and desire to help people trapped in this situation that there's a lot we can build on there. But it is about galvanising people. It's going to be really important when the new batch of MSPs get working that they hit the ground running on this issue and they start coming up with actual practical solutions for people, because I think for too long we've had lots of warm fuzzy words, but we're now at the sharp end. It's not going anywhere. We're not going to get the radical change that I'd like to see between now and June, July. So we really are going to have to get our heads together and come up with an interim solution that's going to enable people to stay, that's going to do that fairly and without excluding people and without putting people at risk. But yeah, I really urge anybody watching this and anybody who wants to have their say on this to register to vote for parties who'll speak up for you at the Holyrood Parliament and hold us to account. You make sure, if we've said that we're going to do this for you, make sure we do, make sure we follow through, and make sure that we're prepared to put ourselves on the line a bit now, because I don't see how we're going to make this change without really quite strong mass civil disobedience and really clear support from our political leaders for that course of action and making that stand, not just for European migrants, but for all migrants, because the hostile environment can't continue. It's not in anybody's best interest to continue this scapegoating of people. We need to face up to the challenges our country faces and work together to resolve them instead of constantly looking for someone else to blame.
Thanks very much, Laura. Katrina.
Well, I would say we've got a long road out of COVID and trying to get our economy back up and running. And if we don't do that in an inclusive way, and, you know, making sure that friends who we welcomed in the past, you know, when people came here from the EU, they did so under a joint agreement that there would be freedom of movement, and they basically had the rug pulled out from under them. It's not their fault we voted for Brexit. It was a UK decision. Okay, we have to live with that. But they were also given promises, and I guess, you know, I'm old-fashioned in terms of my politics. I think if you make a promise in your manifesto that you're going to do something, then that's what you should do. And the EU nationals were promised that they would have a right to stay. It's as simple as that. And that should be made as easy and flexible for them to do that. And, you know, putting things online so that they can't access them, you know, tying them into employment, all of the things that have been highlighted here tonight are just, as I say, that they're just inhumane. I mean, it's about people's human rights as much as anything else. That, you know, if you've come here with the best of intentions to build a life, to contribute to our economy and to our communities and to our social fabric, to then not be allowed to remain and to be given that kind of hostile environment, which the Tories are so keen on, is just, it does make me angry, and it makes a lot of people angry. And we need to get a lot of angry people together to make a stand on this, because, you know, it's people's lives and livelihoods that we're talking about. It's people's futures, and it's our country's future as well, and what kind of country we want to be. And I know that Scotland is more open perhaps than other parts of the UK, but, you know, I think even Britain has had an honourable past of welcoming migrants and refugees, and now for some reason we think, you know, we're full, they don't contribute. And it's just an out and out lie. They contribute hugely economically and socially to our country, and we should welcome them and, you know, allow them to contribute. And those who have already been welcomed should be allowed to stay. So, you know, let's take a more liberal outlook on our communities and on the people who've come here to be part of our communities, and give them the right to stay.
Thanks, Katrina. Thank you very much for joining us. Caitlin, thanks once again that you chose us over the pub in London, and tell us again what's the kind of the biggest campaigns that JCWI has at the moment. What can we do? You mentioned that Home Office consultation. Anything else that kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, I would echo what both Laura and Katrina have said. Scotland, as I kind of mentioned before, the Scottish Parliament have been a great ally to the migrant sector in campaigning for migrants' rights, and with all our calls for EU citizens' rights recently. And I guess I would call on people to, I mean, yeah, we've got less than 3 months now till the deadline, and we're still very much in the grips of the COVID pandemic. So the situation is really urgent, and I would urge people to call on their MP to call on the government to lift the deadline, give people that automatic right to stay, but also, as Laura has kind of mentioned, recognizing that if we aren't going to see the really kind of radical change that we want to see in the next 3 months, we have to be thinking strategically and long term about how to create the kind of society that we want to live in over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I would really encourage people to kind of to join the movement for migrants' rights, to get involved in your local community, but also to get involved in national campaigns. Yeah, get involved with JCWI, call on the government to support migrant workers, to support EU citizens. And yeah, I think we do need to just kind of all come together in this really, really critical time.
Thank you all for joining me. I really enjoyed that conversation, even though we are talking about something that sometimes feels really overwhelming and just so much bigger than what we can achieve. But that's just with everything. That's all political campaigning. Always we're faced with something that we really feel strongly about, and we're trying to change it, and sometimes we succeed. So with the thought of success, I think we need to keep going. I wish you a lot of success in your election campaign as well. Everyone, speak to everyone you know, promote the migrant vote. There's a lot of resources for people in different languages to get registered to vote. That's one small step that you can do to kind of increase representation. But as everyone has said so far, this is going to be a really long struggle ahead of us, and we need to learn to work together and put our minds to practical ways of resisting, and hopefully build a mass movement of resistance across Scotland. Thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of your evenings.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Bye.
Bye.